Hi, and welcome to the show. Rate and review at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today's show, we have Nicholas Tito. He's a medical student. His Kevin MD article is titled The Slippery Slope of Legal Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia. Nicholas, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on. Glad to be here.
All right, we'll get into your article in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Sure. I'm originally from Mississippi, and then parents moved over to California. I followed them after high school, went to undergrad, joined the Army, spent 4 years there, and then decided to torture myself more after that and go to medical school. I'm in my fourth year. I'm applying psychiatry pretty soon here, or I already applied, I suppose, and I'll be matching in about a month. So I'm pretty excited for that. And in the course of this final year, I got an interesting case where, I kind of came to write the article that I submitted to your site because I didn't really have a view on an assisted suicide. And after interacting with this patient, it really changed my mind in favor, as you probably know, against it, as I wrote in the article. And so it's been a fascinating field and going through the ethics of suicide. And there's a long history going back thousands of years on this topic. So there's a plethora of reading to do, and it's a great topic.
All right. So let's talk about how this article came together. You said it started with some type of patient interaction. So tell us about the background and lead into your article.
Yeah, sure. So we had a 60 to 70-year-old patient come in to the inpatient psychiatry unit. So usually a 3 to 5 day stay. EMS was called on her by her family initially because she had threatened suicide by way of traveling to another country. And this one is not Canada, but it's another country with an actually more liberal or more forgiving, I suppose, euthanasia policy. And I'll keep the exact country anonymous for the patient, but she threatened to travel there and commit suicide, which is legal there really for any reason, so long as you sign off on it and you have capacity. She had presented the plane ticket, the hotel room, all the arrangements had been made to go and do this to her family. And so they called EMS, the psychiatrist at the ER convinced her to come into the ER for evaluation, and she wound up on our voluntary unit. Through that course, she actually ended up coming on to our involuntary unit. And this is a lady who she's almost 70 at this point. She's had major depressive disorder on and off since 2004. She's been on Lexapro, and she's been mostly euthymic. I mean, truly, there were no warning signs at all in terms of pathology. And so for her to end up on an involuntary unit, that was quite an experience for her that was unfortunately not very good, as it can be for most people in that instance. But we were in a legal kind of gray area because in the United States, there's not a state at all. There's no states right now where it's legal to commit suicide and not really be held. And she held firm to the belief that, no, I can do this if I want to go to another country and perform this act. And so we really didn't know what to do. So involuntary was the route that we did decide to go. Luckily, she was there very, very briefly. She did agree to abandon the idea, and we had a safe plan for her on discharge. And about 8 months later, I followed up with her, and she thanked me profusely and the physicians I was involved with because she was very happy to still be here. And so, as much as with the new Canadian laws, including mental disease with coming up right here in March as qualifying for legalized euthanasia, this patient, I'm just going to have to keep telling this patient's story because she wouldn't be here if she was in Canada. And so it's a little scary to me. It's why I'm kind of started to write these articles and kind of spread the word about what's going on. And I think the gray area, we're going to start seeing more and more as it kind of makes its way through the popular culture.
Now take us into that time when she was held involuntarily. And you mentioned that you and your team didn't quite know what to do. It was a little bit of a gray area. So take us into a little bit of those conversations in terms of who you talked to. What were those discussions like?
Sure. So in the state that we're in, and it's pretty similar to most other states, an involuntary commitment isn't the psychiatrist writing a signature and you go straight there. It's actually a state screener, a screener by the state, a mental health worker it's in combination with another psychiatrist, but also a non-psychiatrist state sanctioned mental health worker that that really kind of gives the, okay, we're going to do the involuntary. We recommended her for screening for involuntary, not so much because we believe that she didn't have capacity, but because she was a danger potentially to herself, I mean, in the truest sense, and two, you know, some people would say unfortunately, but we do have to legally cover ourselves while practicing clinically. So had we said, okay, we understand that you are going to go do this on soil where it's technically legal, but what if you were to just walk out of our hospital and commit suicide tomorrow? Like, we wouldn't have been doing our job. So that was kind of the quandary that we were in. So the discussion was, you know, do we have the screener come? Because we thought the screener would definitely recommend involuntary, and then that is what happened. But we didn't see a way in which we could address the needs of this patient without recommending the screener come and do the involuntary screening.
Now, you mentioned that eventually she had changed her mind. So why do you think she did that?
Attrition. I think she wanted to get out of the psychiatric hospital, which, you know, I don't blame her by any means. When we go on an inpatient adult psychiatric hospital, on the voluntary side, there's a wide range of pathology. We try to keep the atmosphere friendly, relaxed. You know, it's clinical, but the more clinical it becomes, sometimes the more distrustful patients can be. And so we really don't try to keep it like in the 1950s. But when you go to the involuntary side, unfortunately, and at the time that she was with us, you do sometimes have people that have a history of, you know, violent assault and things like that. And so it's a tough place to be. And the capacity that she had, the clinical pathology that she had, it was a very atypical case to go to the involuntary side. And so I think she largely was still resolute in her decision to continue with the euthanasia at that point. But to get out of the hospital, she kind of understood she needed to say these certain things to the state screener and then now to the judge to make sure she can be released. And so she did do that. But as I spoke with her on follow-up, she was put into the care of a nephew, and they were able to speak at length, and she was closely followed up with mental health workers after this. And from what I gathered, after speaking through it, she came to realize that some of the reason that she wanted to commit the euthanasia, which there was a long list, and, you know, it would take, it's a hard conversation to have. Is this a reasonable thing to do? Reasonable people can have great arguments on really both sides of that coin about what constitutes, you know, a reasonable means for euthanasia. And that's really a conversation for society to have, let alone just a single clinician speaking to a patient, at least in my view, I suppose. But she, you know, 8 months later, she did really regret ever having that thought. And so I take the more classical approach that, you know, suicidal ideation is a psychopathology in itself, and it's a symptom of some other greater mental health issue. And sometimes a patient can seem to be completely reasonable, have capacity, and yet still resolutely want to commit euthanasia. I think those instances are rare, but as we're seeing, and I'm reading through the case reports in Canada, as it kind of becomes popular in the mainstream culture, every suicide patient that's had suicidal ideation, at that moment, life was a low. It was a difficult time, or whatever was causing that pathology. As mental health clinicians, I think we need to make sure that we see suicidal ideation as a psychopathology. And I know it gets a little gray when it comes to, you know, less than 6 months to live, and there's a long history of ethical research into that, and you know, what's ethical in that case. But as far as major depressive disorder and some of these more common mental health issues that Canada is considering including, I think that we need to be prepared for potential ethical conflicts in the workplace.
Now, I want to talk about how this case affected you. So before you encountered this case, did you have any preconceived beliefs or notions about euthanasia? And if so, how did this case change you?
Sure. You know, less than 6 months to live, a hospice patient, I was completely for it. You know, like time in the military, you know, you spend enough time in healthcare, death can be a very ugly thing, unfortunately. And so we have the means to make that less so. And so when it comes to morphine pills, there's something called the law of double effect. And the idea is that, well, if you're giving morphine, you're not actually trying to euthanize the patient. You're just trying to relieve suffering, and death is a consequence of it. But in the terms of a hospice patient saying, well, I want to take this pill on this day to end my life versus the morphine route, I've changed my view on that. I've now come to think that the morphine route's fine, which I originally would, but I used to also think that the pill would be fine as well, physician assisted suicide. But I think after this case, I think just as clinicians, we should stay away from that. I think you get into murky territory in terms of ethics, what our job is to do in terms of heal. And a patient that has less than 6 months to live, but isn't receiving morphine for pain, I'm sure there's instances where it would maybe make sense to do the pill, even to me. But if you're going to ask for like a broad policy belief, I'm against the physician assisted suicide.
After you encountered this case, did you guys have a debrief with your team to discuss all the various ethical questions that arose from it?
Absolutely. And what's interesting and frustrating and fascinating is that every single member of the team has a different belief and came away with something different. I do think that we all kind of agree that, 8 months later, that she is very happy to have not gone through with the decision, that we definitely need to have some more caution in terms of how we're going to do this in the United States. Because I think if it happens up there, and there's advocates who want it to come down here, and it's only a matter of time before that becomes a bigger conversation, I think. But I do, some of the teams that disagree with me, they definitely will acquiesce that this needs to have a very considered conversation before we go forward.
And my final question, Nicholas, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
It's natural to have a visceral gut reaction. And I found that the latest ethic research on this topic, you have to go back to our Greek and Roman forebears and what they believe, because it's quite interesting how they delineated euthanasia back in their time when they didn't even have morphine in those things. And so I think really taking the time to kind of think through, why do I believe what I believe on this subject? Once you come to that conclusion, I think you'll actually walk away with a few other either changed or more firm beliefs across the healthcare ethics spectrum.
All right, Nicholas, thank you so much for sharing your story time and insight, and thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Doctor.